The first warm draft hit my face inside the mine, and it was wrong. Steady, rhythmic, like breath pushed through stone. Our flashlights cut narrow cones through coal dust and timber supports, and every few seconds the air pulsed again, warmer than the tunnel should have been. Sergeant Vickers stopped us with a clenched fist and listened, head tilted as if the rock itself was exhaling. Then we heard the scrape. Not a collapse, not tools. Something dragging lightly along the far wall, keeping pace. We were rangers, not miners. We were there on a quiet site security tasking, no map in the packet, no civilian escort, and a radio that kept popping static. When the next draft came, it carried a wet, metallic smell. Vickers stepped forward into the haze. In that beamless dark, a thin shape shifted, two dull eyes watching. His light snapped off, and he never called back. This channel documents frontline accounts like this one. Subscribe for future reports. We staged out of a small county lot before dawn, 2 unmarked trucks and 4 of us from a ranger platoon on temporary attachment. The briefing was thin. An abandoned coal mine on the Appalachian ridgeline, a recent string of trespass reports, and a request to verify the site after a contractor claimed he felt warm air moving up from sealed lower workings. No one used the word rescue. No one said hazard. Just a grid reference and an instruction to keep it quiet. By 0410, we were hiking in under low cloud, helmets strapped, Alice gear tight, rifles slung but muzzles down. The entrance was a black cut in the hillside, timbered with old warning placards half torn away. Inside, the temperature dropped fast, then leveled into damp cold. Our radios worked for the first 100 meters, then started to hiss like someone breathing into the net. That's when we felt it. The first warm draft, timed like a pulse, coming from below the mine floor. By Geo 5:30, we were a quarter mile in, past the last intact placard, and into a section where the timbers were newer than the rest. Clean cuts, newer spikes, the kind of reinforcement you don't see in a fully abandoned mine. Vickers called a halt and had me mark our turn points in my notebook instead of dropping tape. He didn't like leaving anything behind. The drafts came in intervals, not constant airflow, pulses. Every 6 or 7 seconds, a warm push rolled up from the lower workings, carried through the tunnel like a slow exhale. It wasn't enough to fog our lenses, but it stirred the dust in a pattern that made it obvious the air was moving with intent, not randomness. Each pulse was followed by a thin slack moment, then another. We checked for natural ventilation shafts. In a mine like that, you can get unexpected air movement from a broken vent line or a collapsed chimney. The problem was the warmth. The tunnel around us stayed damp cold, water seeping from rock. But each pulse came warmer than body temperature for a beat, like something had just been close to the air before it reached us. Our radios degraded fast. At first, it was only a faint hiss on the net. Then we started getting breathy bursts that sounded like open mic. Short, wet static that rose and fell with the drafts. Corporal Haynes tried switching channels. Specialist Mercer checked the spare battery. Nothing fixed it. It wasn't dead air, either. It felt like the mine was chewing our signal and spitting it back. We kept moving, slow and quiet, lights down and sweeping. The floor changed from broken slate to packed dirt, and our boots left prints that held their shape. That's when I noticed the first trail. Shallow scratches along the right wall, high enough that a man would have to reach up to make them. Not gouges from equipment, not pick marks. They ran forward in a staggered line, then disappeared where the rock narrowed. Haynes touched one with a gloved fingertip and looked back at Vickers. "Old," he mouthed. Vickers shook his head. The edges were sharp, fresh. A thin dusting of rock powder still clung in the grooves like it hadn't settled yet. The next pulse of warm air pushed through and carried a smell that didn't belong underground. Wet iron and something sour, like stagnant water disturbed. Mercer muttered that we should turn around, call it in, and let someone with gas monitors own it. Vickers didn't argue the fear. He argued the chain. "We verify," he said quietly. "We report. Then we're done." We reached a split where the left passage dead-ended in a fall of timber and stone. The right passage sloped down at a shallow angle. The drafts were stronger there. You could feel them coming up the incline, brushing your face under the brim of your helmet. Vickers signaled a staggered file, and we took the descent one step at a time. Our lights caught moisture beating on the rock, but it wasn't dripping from above. It was forming on the wall in patches. Condensation where it shouldn't have been, like warm air meeting cold stone in localized bursts. In one patch, the moisture had been smeared. Not a random smear. Fingers. 5 long streaks curved down the wet rock, spaced too evenly to be accidental. The handprint wasn't fully formed like a palm press. It looked like something had dragged fingertips through condensation and then pulled away. Haynes inhaled sharply and stopped himself from speaking. Vickers leaned in, studied the marks, then lifted his light off them as if he didn't want to show the wall too long. The drafts kept pulsing. With each one, our lights fluttered. Not off, not dead, but a slight dip like the beam was being swallowed and returned. Mercer's flashlight did it twice in a row, and he slapped the side of it in reflex. The battery indicator was fine. We heard the first knock then. Soft, from deep ahead, too clean to be a rockfall. One, then a pause. Another. It wasn't loud, but it carried through the timber supports like the tunnel itself was a drum. Haynes looked at me, eyes wide under his helmet cover. Vickers raised his fist. We froze and listened. A second knock came. Closer. Then a faint scrape that matched the scratch trails on the wall. Light contact moving forward, keeping pace with us without stepping into the beam. I remember thinking, in a blunt, practical way, that we were being measured. Not hunted in a frantic sense. Observed. Tested. The mine didn't feel empty anymore. It felt occupied. We reached a point where the timbers narrowed and the ceiling dropped. The drafts were stronger and warmer. Brief heat against the cheeks, then nothing. Mercer tried the radio again and got a long burst of wet static that rose and fell in the same rhythm as the pulses. He looked at Vickers like he wanted permission to say what we were all thinking. Vickers didn't give it. He gave a hand signal. One more bend, then we turned back. We rounded the bend. The tunnel ahead opened into a wider cut, and the air changed immediately. Thicker, hazed. Our lights couldn't reach as far. The warm pulses came closer together, like breathing accelerated. Somewhere in that haze, something shifted against rock with a controlled, deliberate sound. Vickers took 2 steps forward into the mist to get his light around the corner, and the beam didn't just dim. It vanished, as if the darkness swallowed it whole. The moment Vickers' beam disappeared, the mine felt deeper, like we'd crossed an invisible threshold. He didn't panic. He did what trained men do when something goes wrong. He backed 1 step, tried the switch again, then raised his other hand for us to hold. Nothing. The flashlight stayed dead dark in his grip, but I could still see the pale gray mist moving in pulses ahead, catching the spill from my light and Mercer's. The warm drafts were closer now, coming faster, each one brushing my face like breath. Timber supports creaked lightly with every pulse, not from pressure, but from vibration, something using the tunnel as a throat. Then the knocking started again, no longer from deep ahead. It came from the right wall beside Vickers, close enough that the rock seemed to answer. 2 quick taps. A pause. 1 longer tap. Another pause. A pattern. Not random. Haynes shifted his muzzle toward the wall, and immediately Vickers cut his hand across his throat. Stop. We were in a mine with unknown gases, unknown stability, and now an unknown presence. Firing wasn't a plan. It was noise. The mist thinned for half a second with the next pulse. In that brief clearing, my beam caught something that should not have been able to stand in that space. A thin upper shape, hunched, almost folded in on itself, with shoulders too sharp for a man and arms that hung too long. It was not fully there, more like a silhouette pressed into the haze, but it held its position as if it knew exactly where the light would fall. I saw the hand first. Fingertips on stone, splayed. Long, jointed, and still. Vickers took a step back without turning his head, trying to keep his body between us and the wall. That's when the mine exhaled hard. The warm draft hit like a sudden gust, pushing dust and mist outward. Our beams fluttered, and the tunnel filled with a wet, metallic smell so strong it burned the back of my throat. In the same instant, Vickers' voice cut through on the radio. Except it wasn't his voice. It was a rasping imitation, broken by static, repeating the last word he'd said in the tunnel. Hold. He jerked as if something had tugged his gear from behind. His dead flashlight clattered on rock. Mercer lunged for him, grabbed webbing, then stopped short, frozen, staring past Vickers into the haze. I followed his stare and saw two dim points deep in the mist, eyes placed too low and too far apart to be human. Vickers did not scream. He made a single, short sound, like air forced out of him, and then the darkness in front of us seemed to fold inward. He was pulled sideways, not forward, into the right wall where the knock pattern had been. For a fraction of a second, his shoulder and helmet pressed against rock as if the stone had softened. Then he was gone. The warm drafts stopped. The mine went cold again, and the tunnel held its breath. We didn't rush the wall. That sounds cowardly on paper, but in that tunnel it was the only disciplined move left. Mercer had half a step forward, hand out, then he stopped himself like he'd hit a line. Haynes kept his rifle up but never took the safety off. I put my light on the rock where Vickers vanished and searched for anything. Crack, seam, void, a timber gap he'd been dragged behind. There was nothing, just damp stone and those fresh scratches at shoulder height still dusted with powder. I keyed the radio and called him by name. The handset answered with a slow, wet hiss, then a clipped imitation of my own voice, half a second delayed. I tried again and got the same thing. My call returned to me, distorted, like the mine was recording us and playing it back through the net. Mercer pressed his palm against the wall. Solid, cold, no give, no draft. The warm pulses that had guided us down were gone, like someone had shut a valve. Vickers' flashlight lay on the floor, lens cracked, switch still on. It should have been shining. It wasn't. Haynes said, very quietly, that we were not going to solve this with 4 men and handheld lights. He didn't have to say the rest. We were in an unmapped working with unstable timbers, failing comms, and 1 missing ranger. If the mine wanted another, it had already learned how to take one without a struggle. We backed out in a tight file, moving slow, marking our turns only in my notebook. No shouting. No hero run back in. Just controlled retreat with our eyes locked on the dark behind us. Outside, the morning air felt thin and clean enough to hurt. We reported exactly what the title says. Warm drafts underground, patterned knocks, and 1 man who never returned from below. By noon, 2 vehicles with no markings met us on the access road. They took our statements, our notes, and the cracked flashlight. A week later, I asked for a copy of the report. There was no paperwork to find. The mine entrance was boarded within days. New timbers, fresh concrete, and a steel grate that hadn't been there when we went in. Locals were told it was a safety closure. Our platoon was told not to discuss the operation outside official channels. No memorial notice went out through the county. No public incident report ever surfaced. Years later, I pulled maps and mining records out of habit. The grid reference we were given doesn't match any listed workings in that ridge. It never did. I still remember the rhythm of those warm drafts, like something below learning to breathe through rock.